Now, I'm not from the US, never lived there, never experienced Thanksgiving, but I know a fair amount about it from the way it's presented in US-made TV shows and movies. I know about the basic ways it's observed. I know about a lot of the discourses around it, the usual jokes about how people eat a lot and how people argue about politics. Though, I only really know about these things as an outsider to the culture, so Thanksgiving really means nothing to me. It just seems kind of stupid to have 2 days in the third quarter of the year where you get all your family over and have a big fancy dinner. It's probably great for supermarkets though. But anyway, it's not Thanksgiving Day itself I want to talk about, but the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. So for those who don't know, this is a parade that they have every year in New York City on Thanksgiving, and it's sponsored by the large department store chain Macy's. It's an opportunity for advertising and reinforcing cultural hegemony, and this is something that they've been doing for decades. The most notable thing in the past has been the balloons that explode or crash into people and put them in comas. And look, I'm not really anti-parade necessarily, I'm just critical of what a given parade represents. So anyway, let's talk about the 2024 Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade being protested by anti-genocide activists. This was special, this was important, and this was kind of genius. Apparently they tried to do this last year, but I must have missed it. This was the year when they seemed to get attention though, and we've got footage of them being very aggressively manhandled by some of the NYPD pigs. So, in case you weren't aware, there is currently a genocide in Palestine being conducted by the Zionist terror state and its IOF militias. The leader of the Zionists was issued an arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court a couple weeks ago, but the US government, along with several other governments, has refused to honor this warrant and is continuing to provide the IOF with weapons, money, and intelligence so that they can continue their genocide. A number of US businesses have also been complicit in the genocide, selling arms to the IOF terrorists or providing them with other technologies, or else simply investing in the terror state. Now, there has effectively been a low-intensity genocide against the Palestinians for many decades, with occasional sporadic periods of intensified violence. The intensification since the end of last year appears to be an attempt by the Zionists to bring about a sort of final solution against the indigenous Palestinian population. They've systematically pushed the majority of the native Palestinian population into 2 Bantustans and are now going through the process of murdering as many of them as possible while they're in these confined areas, with more gradual encroachments in the West Bank and the carpet bombing of the Gaza Strip. The intensification of the genocide has not been unnoticed, and people are taking a stand against it, demanding a ceasefire by the IOF forces. Protesters in Western imperialist nations have been especially vocal because of their own government's complicity in the genocide. And as mentioned, the US in particular is playing a major role in this. It has vetoed attempts to have Palestine be recognized as a state by the UN and has done a lot of other diplomatic measures to counteract attempts to de-intensify the situation. And of course, this is just another instance in a long history of genocide by the US government. Genocide both at home and overseas. And funnily enough, Thanksgiving has become somewhat symbolic of the genocide of North America's indigenous population, with so much of the festival being centered around the myth of the first Thanksgiving, which tries to pretend that there is some sort of deep fraternal bond between the European settlers and the indigenous peoples of the land. The reality is that far from breaking bread with indigenous people, the Europeans systematically wipe them out and force them into confined enclaves where they are subjected to horrendous social conditions to this day. All the while, Europeans claim this land as their own based on the legacy of religious zealots in centuries prior. Does that remind you of anyone else? And in fact, people have traced Thanksgiving traditions back to the literal celebrations of massacres of indigenous peoples. Thanksgiving today tries to whitewash all this history and ignore it. That's why it's important to have activists try and pull people back to reality and call attention to an ongoing genocide that's not too different from the genocides that are foundational to the US's history. So the anti-genocide protesters sat in the middle of the road of the parade route. They held up a banner and Palestinian flags, and the balloon immediately behind them? Ronald fucking McDonald, the clown that exists to soften the image of the fast food corporation he represents. and here promoting the children's charity that exists to do the same. McDonald's in particular has been targeted for its support of Zionism, largely because it's probably the most famous brand supporting the IOF, as well as the one with the worst reputation. Though arguably it's the brand that has done the least in terms of support, it's still been very good that people have boycotted them and called them out, causing them to lose a lot of money and any lingering credibility they still had. That at McDonald's often being seen as a symbol of US cultural hegemony on the same level as Coca-Cola and the Walt Disney Company makes the image of this protest all the more evocative. There are just so many layers to this. The mythologized past of the United States covering up the genocidal foundation of the nation's existence. The parade that exists to promote capitalist interests, encouraging consumer habits with large cartoon mascot characters that invoke positive memories of childhood. The protesters who risked their own safety and freedom to call attention to the murder of people an ocean away. The NYPD taking violent repressive action against anyone who attempts to disrupt this sacred capitalist ritual. The hapless morons in the crowd cheering and chanting USA as the people trying to ruin their fun are beaten and dragged away. Right here in this moment of time is just this amazing collision of ideology, just so many things just compounding on top of each other at once, and the crowd cheering to this violent response by the state against people protesting a capitalist propaganda parade to call attention to a genocide that both the state and the capitalists are responsible for. This tells you everything you need to know. It's a microcosm of what our social reality is under the present neoliberal, neocolonial world order. We're up against very strong, very powerful forces, and those forces have resources that they use to distract and control people. They have created a culture that gets people obsessed, that practically hypnotizes them, and these people purposefully and willfully attempt to abstract that culture from its material reality. But there's also always going to be other people who try to do their best to try and confront people with the bloody reality, to snap them back from the dream world they're living in. These people aren't always going to be popular, but they're necessary. And more of us need to follow their lead as much as possible. You could say, I'm thankful for these anti-genocide activists. And look, as much as I think we're all still allowed to have fun under capitalism, even when that fun is part of the consumerist superstructure that we're all subject to, it's also important for us not to ignore the underlying material implications of the things we enjoy. Being willfully ignorant is tantamount to supporting the system. You can like the balloons, but you also need to recognize what those balloons really represent. You can enjoy the dances and the music and the parade float, but don't forget the realities they're obscuring. You can take a moment to just get lost in it all, but make sure you also take a moment to reflect on the hidden meanings. And you can be upset about the bad things that are happening in the world, but don't get upset by the people who remind you about them.